Welcome to the Sleepkeeper's library. I'm the Mythkeeper, guardian of the stories that refuse to be forgotten. In this timeless library between waking and sleeping, three of us tend the endless shelves. The historian preserves the memory of skilled hands and forgotten crafts from our world's past. His archives hold the voices of those who built beauty with patience, like the clockmakers who captured time itself in brass and jewels. The wanderer walks through histories that never were, guarding the paths time did not take. He wanders between possibilities, collecting worlds that might have been. And I am the keeper of stories that shaped human consciousness. In my section of this ancient library, you'll find the myths that crossed oceans, the legends whispered around fires for thousands of years, the folktales that survived despite every attempt to destroy them. Tonight, I've chosen a volume that speaks to something particularly powerful. The stories that couldn't be written down, that had to live in memory and voice, that survived because people refused to let them go unheard and untold. Songs they couldn't silence, stories they couldn't burn, words passed from grandmother to grandchild in whispers, in code, in melodies that sounded harmless but carried maps to freedom, that sounded like children's games but preserved entire languages, that sounded like work songs but encoded resistance. These aren't myths in the ancient sense, gods and heroes and creation stories. These are the myths of survival, the folklore of oppression and endurance. Every culture that has faced suppression, every people who have been told to forget their language, their stories, their songs, they found ways to remember. And those ways, those methods of preservation, those acts of defiant memory, they follow patterns as old as humanity itself. So settle in, dear listener. Tonight, we're exploring something that might feel close to our own time, yet reaches back through centuries. The oral tradition as weapon and shield, memory as rebellion, the human refusal to be silenced, no matter the cost. Let's begin with something that sounds like worship, but carried maps to freedom. The spirituals of enslaved people in America. Songs that authorities allowed because they seemed to be about heaven and faith. And they were about those things. But they were also about something much more immediate, much more intentional in meaning and purpose. The African American spiritual, wade in the water, wasn't just about baptism, it was instruction. When you're running, when the dogs are after you, wade in the water to hide your scent. The water breaks the trail. The folk song Follow the Drinking Gourd wasn't about finding refreshment. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper, which points to the North Star, which points to freedom. Sing about following it, and you're teaching navigation to people who aren't allowed to learn to read. Swing low, sweet chariot. The chariot wasn't just coming to carry souls to heaven. Sometimes it meant the Underground Railroad was coming. Sometimes a person named Chariot was coming. The song could mean be ready, or hide, or tonight, depending on who was singing it, when and how. The same words carried different meanings in different contexts, and everyone who needed to understand, understood. This is the genius of oral tradition. When it's used as resistance, it's flexible, it adapts, it can't be pinned down. You can't burn a song, you can't confiscate a melody, And if the overseer hears you singing about Jesus, well, that's what he expects from you. He doesn't hear the other conversation happening underneath, in rhythm and repetition and carefully chosen words that mean two things at once. But this pattern, hiding freedom in religious language, encoding maps in metaphor, this isn't unique to American spirituals. It appears wherever people need to communicate dangerous information in public spaces. In Brazil, enslaved Africans developed capoeira, which looked like a dance, sounded like a game with its singing and rhythms, but was actually combat training. The songs that accompanied it taught the moves, marked the rhythm, warned of danger, all while appearing to be entertainment. In the Caribbean, drumming carried messages across distances, village to village, plantation to plantation. The colonizers knew this, tried to ban drums, but the patterns lived on in hand clapping, in foot stomping, in the rhythms of work songs. You can ban an instrument, but you can't ban rhythm itself. It lives in the human body, in the pattern of breath and heartbeat. Work songs everywhere carry this double purpose. On the surface, they synchronize labor. When you're hauling nets, or lifting stones, or cutting cane, singing keeps everyone moving together, makes the work go faster. But underneath, work songs could communicate. A change in rhythm might signal danger. A particular verse might mean slow down or watch the overseer. The call and response pattern meant messages could travel through a whole field of workers in minutes, hidden in plain sound. In the American South, there was a work song that went, "Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on." Simple words, religious on the surface. But during the civil rights movement, those same words took on new meaning. Keep your eyes on freedom, on justice, on the goal. Hold on through violence, through fear, through setback. The song was old, but each generation filled it with their own urgent message, their own hope. Sea shanties, too, carried hidden meanings. Sailors were often pressed into service, essentially enslaved by navies or merchant ships. The shanties they sang synchronized their work, yes, but also passed information about which ships to avoid, which captains were cruel, which ports might offer a chance to escape. Leave Her, Johnny was ostensibly about leaving a ship at the end of a voyage, but it also served as a catalogue of complaints, a warning to other sailors about conditions aboard. The pattern appears again and again across cultures and centuries. When people can't speak freely, they sing. When direct communication is dangerous, they encode. Music passes through barriers that stop words. A mother singing to her child, who would question that? Workers singing to keep rhythm. What overseer would forbid it? Worshippers singing hymns. What authority would call that resistance? But here's what makes this particularly powerful. These songs didn't just communicate practical information, they also carried hope, dignity, identity. When everything else has been stripped away, your language, your name, your family, your freedom, a song remains. You can't take away someone's voice unless you kill them. And even then, the songs they taught will persist in other throats. The spirituals did more than encode directions to freedom. They reminded people that they were human, that they had souls, that their suffering was not the whole story. Deep River promised that one day this burden would lift. Go Down Moses reclaimed a story of liberation, said we too were meant to be free, like the Israelites, like any people held in bondage. and the act of singing together was itself a form of resistance. It created community in a system designed to isolate and break individuals. This is why oral tradition has always frightened authority. Written words can be censored, books can be burned, documents can be destroyed. But a song lives in memory, spreads from person to person, adapts to new circumstances, and survives. You would have to silence every voice, erase every memory, prevent all teaching from one generation to the next. And even then, sometimes someone remembers a fragment, and from that fragment, the whole song can be rebuilt. Songs could encode directions and hope. But what about language itself? What happens when the very act of speaking your mother tongue becomes dangerous? When teaching your children the words your grandmother taught, you could mean punishment, imprisonment, or worse. In Wales, for centuries, there was a deliberate campaign to erase the Welsh language. English was the language of power, of advancement, of legitimacy. Welsh was deemed the language of the past, of backwardness, something to be stamped out for the good of progress. In schools, children caught speaking Welsh were punished. The Welsh knot, a wooden token hung around a child's neck if they were heard speaking their native language, would be passed from child to child throughout the day. Whoever wore it at day's end received a beating. So what did communities do? They created hedge schools, secret schools held outdoors in hidden places, where children learned to read and write in Welsh, where they learned the poetry and stories that made them who they were. The name comes from the literal hedges where teachers would gather students, places where they could scatter quickly if authorities approached. These schools had no buildings to raid, no documents to confiscate. Just a teacher, students, and the language passing from mouth to mouth again. The poetry these schools preserved wasn't simple or quaint. Welsh has one of the oldest continuous literary traditions in Europe. Complex poetic forms with intricate rules of rhythm and alliteration, stories that stretched back to before Rome, genealogies that connected people to land and history. To lose the language would mean losing access to all of that, becoming strangers to your own past. So grandmothers taught in kitchens, farmers taught in fields, and slowly, quietly, the language survived its own supposed death. This pattern, the hedge school, the secret teaching, the hidden preservation of language, appears across the world, wherever colonizers or conquerors try to impose linguistic unity. In Ireland, hedge schools preserved Irish Gaelic and the stories that came with it. During the penal laws, Catholics couldn't legally operate schools, so they taught in hidden places. The tradition of the seanchai, the traditional Irish storyteller, kept the old tales alive, even when speaking Irish could mark you as rebellious or backward. The seanchai didn't just entertain. They were living libraries, repositories of genealogy and history and law. In a culture where much wasn't written down, where manuscripts were rare and often destroyed in conflicts, the seanchai held the memory of the people. They memorized thousands of lines of poetry, hundreds of stories, genealogies, stretching back generations. When a seanchai died, without passing on their knowledge, entire branches of tradition could be lost. So the teaching was urgent, careful, sacred. But here's something that happened with these hidden teaching traditions. they became stronger, more treasured, because of the danger. What might have slowly faded through natural language change instead became precious, worth risking punishment to preserve. The act of suppression created resistance. The attempt to erase created fierce determination to remember. Across the Atlantic, Yiddish-speaking communities faced repeated attempts to destroy not just their language, but their entire culture. The pogroms of Eastern Europe, the Nazi Holocaust, these weren't just physical violence, they were also cultural annihilation. Books burned, communities scattered, families destroyed. But Yiddish stories survived because they lived in more than books. They lived in the tradition of storytelling, in the way grandparents told tales to children, in the jokes and proverbs and songs that traveled from mouth to ear across oceans. There's a whole tradition of Yiddish folktales about survival through cleverness, about outwitting the powerful, about making do with nothing. These weren't just entertainment, they were teaching survival strategies, preserving a worldview that said, we're small, we're vulnerable, but we're smart and we endure. Stories about Shelm, the mythical town of fools, taught through absurdity. Stories about the golem protected Prague in legend and preserved Hebrew mysticism in metaphor. Sholem Aleichem's stories of Tevye weren't written in secret, but they captured a world that was vanishing. And when they were passed down orally, retold in kitchens and gatherings, they became a form of resistance against forgetting. In the Americas, indigenous peoples faced perhaps the most systematic attempt to destroy oral tradition in human history. Children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools, where speaking their native languages was forbidden, where the explicit goal was to eliminate the heritage, save the man. Native languages, stories, songs, and spiritual practices were criminalized. Being caught practicing traditional religion could mean imprisonment. So the stories went underground. They were told in secret, passed on in fragments, hidden inside what colonizers thought were harmless children's tales or entertainment. Coyote stories, raven stories, spider stories. These trickster tales were allowed because they seemed like simple animal fables, but they carried sophisticated philosophy, environmental knowledge, historical memory, and spiritual teaching. The stories taught survival, adaptation, the importance of community, the relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world. Some stories were split apart and scattered, different families who hold in different pieces, so that if one family was completely destroyed, fragments would survive elsewhere. Some were encoded in beadwork patterns, in basket designs, in dances that looked like cultural performances to outsiders, but actually preserved historical events, territorial boundaries, seasonal knowledge. When you can't write it down, you weave it into everything else, into art, into ceremony, into the patterns of daily life. And some communities made a heartbreaking choice. They stopped teaching the stories to children, reasoning that if the children didn't know, they couldn't be punished for knowing, couldn't have that knowledge beaten out of them in schools. The elders held on to the stories alone, waiting for a time when it would be safe to pass them on again. Sometimes that time came. Sometimes the last speaker died before it was safe, and the language died with them. But even partial survival meant possible revival. In recent decades, many indigenous communities have worked to reclaim, and reconstruct their languages and traditions from those fragments that survived. They've interviewed the last elderly speakers, studied the old recordings anthropologists made, analyzed the patterns in art and artifacts. They've built new stories on old foundations, honoring what was preserved by those who refused to let everything die. The Hawaiian language nearly went extinct. By the 1980s, fewer than 50 children spoke it as their first language. But elders had preserved it. Teachers had maintained schools in secret, even when they were illegal. And families had continued speaking it at home, despite pressure to abandon it. From that remnant, a revival grew. Now thousands of children learn Hawaiian in immersion schools. The language is co-official with English in Hawaii. And the stories that came with it, the chants, the mo'olelo, the ancient knowledge, are being taught again. This is the power of oral tradition as preservation. It's flexible, it adapts, it can be hidden in plain sight. And it only needs one person to remember to keep it alive until safer times. Written traditions can be more stable, more detailed, but they are also more vulnerable. Burn a library and you erase that knowledge. But a story that lives in 100 minds, 1,000 minds, scattered across a continent, you can't erase that without erasing every single person who carries it. Scottish Gaelic, Breton, Cornish, Manx, Celtic languages that were suppressed, that nearly died, that are now being revived from the remnants that oral tradition preserved. The Sami languages of northern Scandinavia, nearly erased by aggressive assimilation policies, now being reclaimed by younger generations who interview elders and reconstruct what was scattered. Aboriginal Australian languages, some completely lost, others preserved by the last speakers, long enough for recording and teaching to begin again. Each revival is both a victory and a tragedy. A victory because something survived. A tragedy because of everything that was lost, because of the violence and suppression that made preservation so difficult. But the fact of survival at all speaks to something profound about human stubbornness, about the refusal to forget, about the power of someone saying, "No, this matters. I will remember, even if it costs me." So why does authority fear stories? Why go to such lengths to suppress songs, ban languages, punish people for teaching their children the words their own grandparents spoke? It seems almost absurd. What danger could a lullaby pose? What threat could a folktale carry? But authority understands something fundamental. Memory is identity, and identity is resistance. When you know who you are, where you came from, what your people survived and accomplished, you become much harder to control. You have context, you have pride, you have a story that says, we are more than what you're telling us. We are. The colonizer wants to write a simple narrative. Before we arrived, there was nothing worth preserving. We brought civilization, progress, enlightenment. You should be grateful. This story only works if the colonized forget their own histories, their own achievements, their own ways of understanding the world. So the colonizer burns the books, bans the language, punishes the storytellers, not out of simple cruelty, though there's often that too, but out of a logical understanding that cultural memory threatens colonial control. Consider what the Spanish did in the Americas. They didn't just conquer militarily. They systematically destroyed codices, burned libraries, killed the priests and scholars who held the oral traditions. The Aztec, Maya, and Inca had sophisticated systems of knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, history, philosophy. But if that knowledge remained accessible, if people remembered what they had built and understood, they might question Spanish authority. They might say, "We had cities and learning and governance before you came. We don't need you to tell us how to live." So the knowledge had to be destroyed, or at least driven so far underground that it couldn't threaten the new order. And yet, it survived in fragments, in the few codices that were hidden, in oral traditions that continued in remote villages, in the syncretism that hid indigenous practices inside Catholic ritual. Memory found ways to persist because people understood that memory was survival. This is why totalitarian regimes always attack memory. Nazi Germany didn't just murder Jewish people, they tried to erase Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish contribution to civilization. They burned books by Jewish authors, banned Jewish music, destroyed Jewish art. The goal was to make it as if Jewish culture had never existed, had never contributed anything worth remembering. But they failed because memory lived in too many places, in too many minds scattered across the world. The Soviet Union tried to create a new Soviet person, which meant erasing older identities: national, religious, cultural. Ukrainian identity was suppressed, Jewish practice was criminalized, Central Asian languages were given Cyrillic alphabets to separate them from their Islamic cultural roots. The stories people told about their own histories had to conform to Soviet narratives or be hidden. And so, for 70 years, stories were told in whispers, religious practices continued in secret, languages were taught in hidden corners. When the Soviet Union fell, all of that suppressed memory came flooding back. Not perfectly preserved, much was lost, but alive enough to reclaim. China's Cultural Revolution tried to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. Anything traditional was suspect. Books were burned, temples were destroyed, intellectuals were persecuted, and families were punished for teaching their children about the past. But the old stories didn't die completely. They lived in elderly minds, waiting. They lived in families who risked teaching in secret. They lived in distant villages where the Red Guard's reach was limited. And when the political winds shifted, when it became safer, those stories emerged again, battered, incomplete, but alive. This is the pattern, repeated across history and geography. Authority tries to control the narrative, to write the only acceptable version of history and identity. But oral tradition is slippery, adaptable, impossible to fully suppress. It doesn't need official sanction. It doesn't need institutions or buildings or government support. It just needs two people, one to tell, one to listen and remember. And that's both its vulnerability and its strength. Oral tradition is vulnerable because it can be lost so easily. One generation that decides not to teach. One community completely destroyed. One language that dies with its last speaker. But it's strong because it's distributed, it's flexible. It evolves and adapts to new circumstances while maintaining core truths. You can't burn all the copies because there are no copies. Only living memory in countless minds. And here's something else that makes oral tradition particularly dangerous to authority. It's democratic in a way that written tradition often isn't. Books require literacy, leisure time to read, money to buy, or access to libraries. But stories, anyone can tell a story. Anyone can listen. The grandmother who never learned to read can teach her grandchildren their history. The illiterate laborer can pass on the songs of resistance. Knowledge doesn't depend on formal education or social class. It flows through communities in patterns as old as language itself. This is why the griot tradition in West Africa was so important and so dangerous to colonial powers. Griots were oral historians, genealogists, musicians, diplomats. They memorized vast amounts of history, maintaining the official records of kingdoms without writing. They could recite genealogies going back centuries, preserving not just names, but stories of each person's deeds, their character, their contributions. This oral archive was incredibly detailed, incredibly accurate, passed down through families of griots who trained for years to master the tradition. When European colonizers arrived, they dismissed this oral knowledge as primitive, unreliable, not real history. But they also tried to suppress it, because griots maintained African identity, African achievement, African political structures. The griots remembered when African kingdoms were powerful, when African courts were sophisticated, when African scholars were learned. This memory contradicted the colonial narrative that portrayed Africans as primitive people who needed European guidance. So the tradition was discouraged, marginalized, labeled as entertainment rather than education. But griots continued because communities valued them, because the knowledge they carried was considered sacred trust. And when African nations gained independence, when African history began to be written by Africans, the griots' oral traditions became essential sources. They had preserved what colonizers had tried to erase, proof that African civilizations were complex, sophisticated, worthy of respect and study. This, then, is the universal pattern. Oral tradition persists not because it's easy or convenient, but because people recognize it as essential to their humanity. To forget your history is to become unmoored, to lose the context that makes sense of your present. To forget your language is to lose access to the particular way your ancestors understood and described the world. To forget your stories is to become whoever the powerful say you are, rather than who you know yourself to be. So people remember, despite punishment, despite danger, despite the easier path of forgetting and assimilating. They teach their children in whispers. They encode knowledge in songs that sound harmless. They pass down fragments, trusting that someday it will be safe to piece them together again. They become living archives, human libraries, walking repositories of everything authority wants them to forget. And this ultimately is why these stories matter to us now, even if we're not from the cultures that preserved them. They show us something essential about human resilience, about the refusal to be erased, about the power of saying, "I remember," when you're told to forget. They remind us that knowledge doesn't just live in books and institutions, that culture isn't just what's written down and officially sanctioned. The most important things might be the ones passed from voice to voice, from generation to generation, carried in memory because they're too precious to risk losing any other way. As I close this volume and return it to my shelves, I find myself thinking about the connection between these stories and the work of my colleagues in this library. The historian preserves the memory of skilled hands and forgotten crafts, the clockmakers who captured time in brass and jewels, the bookbinders who made knowledge permanent. His archives hold the evidence of human patience and precision, the tangible proof of what we built and how we built it. But what I guard is perhaps more fragile. The intangible knowledge that can't be held in your hand, can't be locked in a case, can only live in memory and voice. Both are essential. The historian's crafts leave artifacts that survive centuries. My stories leave only the echo of voices, but they too survive, passed from mouth to ear to mouth again. And I wonder what the wanderer might have found in his alternate timelines. Worlds where these suppressions never happened, where languages were allowed to flourish, where oral traditions were recorded and honored, rather than criminalized and hidden. Or perhaps timelines where the suppression was more complete, where the stories didn't survive, where entire cultures were successfully erased from memory. The fact that in our timeline, so much survived despite everything, that speaks to something stubborn and beautiful in human nature, something that refuses erasure. These stories I've shared tonight, the spirituals that encoded freedom, the hedge schools that preserved Welsh, the fragments of indigenous knowledge that survived boarding schools, the griots who maintained African history, they're all part of a larger truth. Memory is not passive. Memory is an act of will, sometimes an act of defiance. Choosing to remember, choosing to teach, choosing to pass on stories when forgetting would be safer. These are acts of courage. And the songs that couldn't be silenced, they're still singing, not always in their original forms, not always complete, but alive. The Welsh language thrives now in schools and in literature. Hawaiian is being reclaimed by a new generation. Yiddish, though diminished, persists in literature and scholarship and the memories of those who grew up speaking it. Indigenous languages across the Americas are being revived from fragments, rebuilt from memories, taught again to children. None of this erases the violence of suppression, the loss of what couldn't be recovered, the languages and stories that died with their last speakers. The victories are partial, the losses are real. But the survival itself, the fact that anything persisted through such determined attempts to destroy it, that's worth honoring. That's worth remembering. Because these stories teach us something we still need to know. That culture lives in people, not just in institutions. That knowledge can survive without official sanction. That a grandmother teaching her grandchild an old song is performing an act of profound importance. That memory, even fragmented and imperfect, is better than forgetting. That the human voice, speaking words passed down through generations, carries something precious that no technology can replace. Thank you for spending this time with me this evening. If this journey through memory and survival has moved you, if it's made you think about the stories in your own family, the languages in your own lineage, I hope you'll return next week. I'll be here, opening another volume from my collection, sharing another set of myths and legends that shaped human consciousness, that survived against the odds, that deserve to be remembered. Until then, rest well, dear listener. And perhaps, before you sleep, think about the stories you carry, the ones that were passed to you from voices that came before. Those stories are part of this great tradition too. The human refusal to let the past be erased, the determination to remember, the songs that couldn't be silenced. The library waits, always, for those who seek the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Good night.